Hello and welcome to My Baseball History, presented by the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum and Baseball Library in Greenville, South Carolina. I'm your host, Dan Wallach, and I'm the Executive Director of the museum. My Baseball History is a long-form interview podcast where each episode I'll talk to someone new who has some sort of association to the game of baseball. No matter who I talk to, we'll talk about how they fell in love with baseball, how their career started, and how they got to be where they are today. On today's episode, I spoke with the official historian of Wrigley Field, Brian Bernardoni. Brian and I met on April 9th, 2018. I don't remember the exact date I meet every person, but this one sticks out in my brain as pretty memorable. That day was supposed to be the Chicago Cubs' home opener that season. Before moving to South Carolina for the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum, I used to bartend at a bar in Wrigleyville called Yaxie's. Their first location opened in 1966 on Diversey, but they opened a Clark Street location just across the street from Wrigley in 1990. Every Cubs home opener, Yaxie's would open at 6 a.m. and have WXRT, a local radio station, broadcast from our beer garden. It became quite a tradition for a lot of people, and Brian was one of them. Every year, he would post up in his favorite corner of the bar and hang out the entire time from when our doors opened until the game was about to start. And in 2018, he was at my bar. Or, I was at his. He was wearing a World Series ring, so after some pleasantries, I asked him how he was lucky enough to have one. Once we found out about our shared love of baseball history, we had a great conversation. My tips from everyone else may have suffered a bit that day because I was much more interested in talking to Brian about baseball than serving people their 9th beer of the day at 10:40 a.m., but I think I ended up making the right decision in who I focused my energy on. The crazy thing about that day specifically, though, was that the game didn't even happen. On April 9th in Chicago, snow is a very real possibility. And that day, it snowed. So much so, in fact, that the game was called. The neighborhood just ended up becoming a different kind of sloppy, drunken mess than it would have been if it were 70 degrees that day. But that was the day I met Brian, so it's one that I'll never forget. In this episode, we covered lots of ground. Brian tells us the story of many of the iconic features of Wrigley Field. We find out why the Cubs didn't play their first night game at Wrigley until 1988, even though it almost happened in 1942. We learn that Wrigley Field has hosted many events, sports and otherwise, besides baseball over the years. And we hear the story of an international softball tournament which took place at Wrigley in 1933 and eventually led to the creation of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. With all of that information and much, much more coming at you, it may be helpful to follow along with the episode's liner notes on our website. You'll still be able to enjoy the interview without the extra help, but sometimes when I'm listening to things like this, I like to really go in depth. So I've provided some photos and links to give you all a better understanding of the things Brian and I are discussing. Those liner notes can be found at the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum website, which is online at www.shoelessjoejackson.org. If you want to follow along, head over to the museum's website and click on the podcast tab at the top. You can also just head to shoelessjoejackson.org/shoelesspodcast, and it will take you right there, where you can click on the Brian Bernardoni episode or any past episode you may want to catch up on. Everything in the liner notes goes in chronological order of how we talked about them in the interview, so you should be able to easily keep your place as you listen. If you guys listened to the first episode of Season 1 of My Baseball History, you heard me talk about the fact that I grew up a White Sox fan. So naturally, anytime my grandma would give me anything baseball related when I was a kid, anytime she saved a newspaper article for me, or anytime she saw a souvenir in a store or gift shop, it was Cubs related. Normally I would just throw the newspapers away or give anything cool to my friends who actually were Cubs fans, but one time she got me something pretty cool. It was a painted baseball of Wrigley Field. Just because I wasn't a Cubs fan didn't mean that I refused to go to Cubs games. Wrigley was a lot closer and easier to get to from my house than Comiskey was, and before interleague play, if there was a player in the National League who I wanted to see play in person, the only option was to go see their team when they came in town to play against the Cubs at Wrigley. So I decided to keep that baseball. I found the matching one for Comiskey Park a few months later, and I had the beginnings of a modest collection on my hands. Over the years, if I would visit a new stadium, I would try to find the baseball for that stadium to add to my collection. I wanted a ball for every place I'd seen a game. So when my parents and I took a trip to the old Yankee Stadium, I got the Yankee Stadium ball. When we went to Boston, I got the Fenway Park ball. It was a cool, inexpensive way for me to remember my trips. It turns out that the company who made those baseballs is still around. They're called Unforgettaballs, and their owner, founder, and the artist behind all of the baseballs listens to our show. Her name is Emily, and she got in touch a few weeks ago saying she was a fan of My Baseball History, that she wanted to contribute a baseball for the giveaway I do every episode. She doesn't even know the story I just told, that I used to collect her work growing up, but when she emailed me, it brought back a ton of great memories. Emily creates original paintings that she does actual size, and then the painting is printed onto each baseball. She's been in business for over 25 years and has more than 150 different baseball designs on her website, which you can find at unforgettaballs.com. After talking with her over the last few weeks and discussing what episodes I had left for the first season of My Baseball History, we figured it would be cool to choose a ball from her catalog that fit the theme of today's episode to give away. The baseball we'll be giving away this week depicts opening day at Wrigley Field in 1926. This seems like kind of a random day to have picked to immortalize, especially for baseball fans who know that Wrigley Field was actually built in 1914. But as you'll learn in the interview today, the stadium was originally built for Chicago's Federal League team, not for the Cubs. The Cubs didn't play their first game there until April 20th, 1916. So why is this ball painted with scenes from the 1926 opening day? Because 1926 was the first year the stadium at the corner of Clark and Addison was called Wrigley Field. At the end of the episode, I'll explain how you can answer a trivia question on Twitter to win that baseball, so stick around until the end of the episode for that. The winner of last week's trivia contest was John Malarkey, who is on Twitter at JLMoles2. After listening to the Craig Purcell episode of My Baseball History, John knew that the movie that was playing on the TV during Field of Dreams was Harvey, which starred Jimmy Stewart. John, shoot me a DM on Twitter at Shoeless Podcast with your mailing address, and I'll send you your prizes. But now, here's my interview with Wrigley Field historian Brian Bernardoni.
My name is Brian Bernardoni. I'm a public affairs professional in Chicago, but for purposes of this, I've been a longtime Wrigley Field scholar and historian. I started working for the Chicago Cubs in 1998. I grew up in Chicago's southwest side, the Garfield Ridge community, so by blood, I should be a White Sox fan. But the story that I think is most appropriate for this is when I was a kid, my dad worked second shift. And as a result of my dad working second shift, I came home alone. Mm-hmm. I was a latchkey kid before I think that phrase was coined. A lot of Generation Xers, we were all like that. And I would come home and Chicago Cubs baseball was on TV. During that time period, the Chicago White Sox were not on TV. They were on TV if you were lucky, or they were on different, they weren't really accessible. Mm-hmm. And as a result, I would come home and watch WGN and became a Cub fan. So my first Chicago Cubs teams were actually the 1977 teams led by guys like Steve Entreveros, Dennis Lamp, Mike Krukow. I mean, really bad teams. Barry Foote catching. There's a strange little story that goes along with it. When Jack Brickhouse died, I went to the wake and I saw Pat Brickhouse, who eventually would end up not only becoming just a close personal friend, but actually she gave the toast at my wedding. But when Jack passed, I walked up to Pat, who I didn't know at that moment, and told her that Jack had babysat me for all these years, and she kind of looked at me quizzically, and I explained to her, the old man worked second shift, and the only one who kept me out of trouble was Jack Brickhouse, Vince Lloyd, and Lou Boudreau. Mm-hmm. And she understood immediately, and we were able to build a nice relationship out of it. But I grew up Garfield Ridge, and then when I was in my formative years, moved out to suburban Justice, Illinois, which is just outside of Midway Airport in the southwest suburbs, and stayed in Justice until my high school days, and moved to Chicago, and strangely enough, I'm back in Justice in the house that my grandparents built.
So who was your favorite Cubs player growing up?
Dave Kingman.
Yeah?
Yeah, Dave Kingman was my number 10. I met him at a Cubs convention. Kingman is frightfully close to that 500 home run marker, which says you're in Cooperstown, and as his eligibility, I think, was slipping for Cooperstown, he was never going to make it into the Hall of Fame, but I think he was putting in the college try to get out there again, and the media had been pretty tough on him. He had been pretty tough on the media when he was a player here in Chicago. But in my formative years, he was the number 10 to me. I never saw Sano play. Mm-hmm. So when I saw him at Cub convention, he was walking down the hallway, and I go from being, at that point, I was probably 35 or 40 years old. I walked up to him and I felt like I was 12 again. And I just said, I don't even think I used his first name. I just said, Mr. Kingman, I just want you to know you were my number 10.
Mm-hmm.
And he smiled, and we ended up in Kitty O'Shea's and had a couple beers. And you know, he goes, you want a beer? Yeah. I mean, to have a beer with Dave Kingman. I mean,
how are you going to say no to that?
I mean, I still have a Dave Kingman 7-Up poster. I mean, and you know, but Kingman was really, he destroyed any dreams I had of playing baseball, because I learned how to do that uppercut batting stroke that he had, which meant I was vulnerable to the same things he was. It was either I was going to hit it a mile if I connected, or I was going to strike out. But there's no joke to that. I seriously had to learn how to correct myself from that swing, and I didn't learn it until I was playing softball over in Grant Park, you know, where you bring that down, and then, you know, I learned how to slap the ball and you know, and punch it. But Kingman was really that player. I mean, fundamentally they weren't great teams, but they're names that all Cub fans would really know. Billy Buckner, Ivan DeJesus, guys like Jerry Martin. Those were the days of Preston Gomez and Joey Amalfitano and just brutally bad teams. But that was also the beginning of the rise of the Cubs on WGN too. So that was as when WGN became a superstation when it went to cable. So I think a lot more people became aware of not only the Cubs, but more importantly, I think Wrigley Field.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge reason why the Cubs have such a large following, is national audience. And them, the Cardinals, the Braves, these teams who had TV deals, or obviously the Yankees from early on. But if you've got 1 million people watching you, you've got 1 million eyeballs, or 2 million eyeballs, I guess, if
or even
potential fans.
Well, it's a national audience. I mean, you remember there's WOR out of New York, WTVS out of Atlanta, which brought you Skip Carey, and WGN out of Chicago. And, you know, that was able to really build that fan connection out, very importantly, out on the West Coast, that brought that national team kind of idea. And while Atlanta really wanted to try and do it, who wants to end up in Atlanta? You know, Chicago's the place you wanted to end up. And the more important thing is, I think people got to see the beauty of the ballpark. I know for me, I wish this was my line, but it's not. It's Billy Crystal's. But I remember watching those games on a small black and white TV in my dad's kitchen. And my dad and I, both having grown up on the South Side, going to the North Side was not something that was natural for my dad, not natural for me at all. And I finally had convinced him for Dave Kingman Day to take me up to Wrigley Field. And I love the line Billy Crystal says about it, and it's appropriate here. It was the first game I ever saw in color, because I had gone to Comiskey Park, and anyone who remembers Sox Park, it was kind of gray and dingy even on a beautiful day. Wrigley, September of 1980, it was green and lush and ivy, and it was breathtaking. And when you're a little guy, you know, 11, 12 years old, and you're seeing Wrigley Field for the first time, it's a transformative moment for you. And it's going to sound hokey, but it changed my life, changed a lot of my direction of where I was going to go and what I thought. Sox Park, the old Sox Park, was a magnificent place. I could talk almost as long about old Sox Park as I can about Wrigley, but the big difference, as you mentioned, and I think it's apt, the Sox didn't have a large cable following. And I love when Sox fans piss and moan about, you know, well, this is, you know, they all have a chip on their shoulder about it.
Yeah.
Well, don't blame the Chicago Cubs for it. Blame your ownership that decided to go with a small radio station rather than a big radio station. Blame your ownership for not going onto cable and going on pay TV at the time and killing the goose. I mean, the White Sox, if you really think about it, during that time period, I mean, you were coming off the 1977 team, which was amazing. But, you know, aside from the 1983 team, which was awesome, I mean, they were an amazing team in that era. You had some really good baseball on the Sox side. It's just you had lousy decision making on ownership of.
You could say the same thing about the Blackhawks.
Exactly. And
right.
No one could see those games unless you went to the ballpark.
Right. And how do you expect to grow a fan base if nobody's coming to see your product? And how do you expect people to come to see your product if they don't know that it's there?
And you had Harry Carey in his youth. I mean,
Right.
if for, I was fortunate enough to have met Harry Carey and to have known Harry Carey and to have met and known Jimmy Pearsall. I mean, I'm Chicagoan,
Mm-hmm.
and 52 years old, and I these are people I met, and some of them I got to know. To have been around, to have been able to have had access to Harry Carey or Jimmy Pearsall when they were at the White Sox when they were younger. I mean, those guys were crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, you had all that energy that Wrigley has now on the South Side, but again, not to blast the White Sox in particular, but it's just a lot of decisions that weren't long-range decisions happened.
Right.
And as a result, the Sox are always going to be second in this town.
Was that experience at Wrigley your first time going for, was it literally Dave Kingman Day?
It was Dave Kingman.
So what
And then what do I remember? Dave Kingman didn't show up. It's a true story. Dave Kingman didn't make it to his own day at Wrigley. It was a scandal. Yeah, it was a scandal.
What else do you remember about Wrigley that day?
Willie Stargell hitting a home run. The Cubs won 13-3. I still have my scorecard from that game. It was nice to see the Cubs win. I just remember we had seats in the upper deck in what were the 400th section down the third base line. I haven't sat up there too often since then. I love those seats. They're great seats. When I saw the Cubs clinch against the Dodgers, I was seated in almost the same area that I did for my first game.
Awesome.
I went with my college roommate to see the Dodgers lose to us and for us to go to the World Series, and it was the same viewpoint. But again, I'll never forget going up into that upper deck and seeing that ivy for the first time with my own eyes in color. It was amazing. It was just an amazing thing.
When you go to games now, where do you like to sit?
I prefer upper deck of all things.
Really?
I prefer upper deck in what used to be the it's where the Catalina Club is, but those seats were section 420, 421, 422. I like the first base side upper deck. It's not usually as hot. You're covered a little bit in case things get crazy. Still a little bit in foul ball territory, but you get a beautiful vantage point of the whole ballpark.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I'm a person who works with the Cubs, but it's really hard to find a bad seat in that ballpark. But the upper deck, even more for concerts, I would say. I've gotten to see a number of shows there, and upper deck can be very chill. I mean, Rolling Stone called it too. That Wrigley Field's one of the greatest venues in the world to go see a concert, and I love the upper deck.
Cool. Today you are, a Wrigley Field historian, but it was kind of a long journey for you to get there. Can you tell me a little bit about starting as a tour guide in 1998?
Yeah, in 1998, the Cubs only gave tours on weekends when the Cubs were away. And it was kind of a ragtag group of guys that were doing the tours. The tours were relatively a new idea. I became familiar with the tours intimately in 1997 when a friend of mine who's a past president now of the Illinois Bar Association, John LaCallo, he was giving tours, and I knew more about the ballpark than he did. And I said, typical Chicago fashion, how do I get on? Do you got a guy? How do you do this? And he's like, fill out an application and maybe you can get on next year. He'd put in a good word. And I got the call in 1998 and started giving tours. It was very cool because the best part about the ballpark tours for a tour guide, it's going to sound weird, but it's actually when I first get into the park in the morning. And this feeling has not left me since 1998. I'm in the ballpark. I've got a Major League Baseball ID, and I can walk around the ballpark when there's nobody there. And I've watched the ballpark wake up. I've watched squirrels play on the field. I've watched the sunrise coming over the right field wall. And it is, to me, it's a religious experience watching that ballpark wake up. And then you see the groundsmen come out and they start tapping down the dirt and getting the field ready or mowing the lawn. They're out there very, very early. I mean, no one works harder inside that ballpark than the guys who are on the ground crew.
So for a 1 o'clock start,
they're out there by 6 a.m, if not earlier. And if there was a game the day before, you're not only watching the groundsmen, but the guys who are cleaning the seats,
right,
and hosing those down. Those, Wrigley Field was one of the first ballparks where they hosed down the seats after every game, and that was a rule from P.K. Wrigley that the ballpark had to be cleaned, mainly because Wrigley understood that there were men and women who liked baseball, and women were not going to go into a dirty ballpark. So therefore you had to clean the ballpark every single day. And that tradition is not only a job creator now, but the fact of the matter is, it is what it is. Wrigley Field is kind of like Chicago. Go to Chicago versus New York, and Chicago is a clean city. Wrigley Field is a clean ballpark. Yeah. And those guys are hosing things down from the top of the upper deck all the way down. Water drops down into the lower section, and it goes through. The groundsmen are there probably 5:30, 6 o'clock, if not earlier. And I've never been there before the groundsman. I'll put it that way. And I will, if I had a 9 o'clock start, I would get there sometimes 6:30 or 7. Because, I talked to the guys cleaning out the dugout. I got to know the guys that did that, the guys who worked on the scoreboard. And the best way to do it is go out there and help them. Yeah. And that early morning experience is wonderful. I love giving the tours. The tours, to share what I know about Wrigley and to get new questions is great. But that quiet time where I have a cup of coffee or green tea and just watch the ballpark wake up, it's stirring to me. It still is. It doesn't matter. Even when it's winter and you walk through that ballpark has an energy to it, and it can be a very positive energy. Or if you've been in that ballpark, when you can feel the mood of that ballpark shift.
There was a day in 2003 where that happened.
There was a day in 2003 where that happened, where you feel the ballpark. Even in 2015, you can feel that ballpark. It gets heavy, and you can feel that weight. It's part of my soul. Yeah, that's all.
So when you started as a tour guide, you kind of wanted to freshen up on your Cubs history and Wrigley Field history. So you started doing some research. That research eventually turned into what the tour guides used for giving the tours. How did that process start? Had you been a researcher your whole life, and then you're just like, oh, hey, I can use the stuff I've already done? Or were you like, I want to be great at this new job, I'm going to start going really in depth here?
So the notes that the Cubs gave us in 1998 were done by the Tribune Corporation, and they were very basic. And let's be blunt and candid. I mean, fans don't need to know everything we know. But in reality, they were basic. And I was a former reporter and journalist, and some things just didn't add up from what I had read historically over time and my own knowledge. And I come from the old school. I used to work for the Des Plaines Valley News, which was a hard news weekly. It's still in publication here in the southwest suburbs. And I worked for a former Chicago Daily News guy, and he kind of set the standard for, if your mother tells you she loves you, you check it out. I mean, you check out everything. So I started fact checking everything that was going on, and what I started to do was I started augmenting the stories that were out there. Anyone who has had teachers that have woken up their soul versus a teacher who speaks to you kind of like the teachers did in Charlie Brown. Wah, 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 wah. Anyone can say the ballpark was built in 1914 and it costed $250,000. And you know what? You're going to get bored. You're going to take your pictures and you're fine. To me, let's add some life to the stories. And I think people at the end of the day will always remember a story before they'll remember a fact. If someone tells you a good joke, right, you're going to remember that versus, something else.
And I think it's different today than it was in 1998 when the internet wasn't so prevalent. But today, if I want to know anything about Wrigley Field, I can look up on Wikipedia or any website when it was built, how much it costs, what that translates to in dollars today. Like, I don't need the facts and figures. I want the stories.
Yeah, I've always gone with allure. I think, I always start my Wrigley Field tour the same way. It's the story of the Babe Ruth called shot. As long as baseball is played, the memory will long live of a bulbous man on matchstick leg, pointing in an elegant gesture towards Wrigley Field's faraway center field barrier, the jibes of 50,000 Chicago fans searing his ears. There were 2 called strikes on George Herman Babe Ruth, like there had been many times in his career. 2 called strikes, and there stood baseball's greatest hitter in the sunset of his career, majestically drawing a bead on a spot 400 feet away. The score was 4-4 in the 5th, and Ruth's Yankees were gunning for their 3rd straight win. Contemptuously, the Babe held up 2 fingers and pointed. Charlie Root pitched. He shouldn't have done it. Like a projectile, the ball left the Ruthian bat to scream on a line over the right center field barrier. And then I stop. And then I go, as long as baseball is played. And I grab them right away with that story. I point at the right moment. I pace and I watch what people are doing as I know that I've got them with the story. And then I spend the next 5 minutes debunking the whole story. That, if you know the story of the called shot, you know that Billy Jurgis was playing shortstop, and Billy Jurgis and Babe Ruth did not get along. And Billy Jurgis had a lot of, basically cut out one of Babe Ruth's former teammates, Mark Koenig, out of a full share of the World Series cut. Koenig was part of the original Murderers Row. He's one of the first guys to actually wear a number on the back of his uniform. And Billy Jurgis, when he got shot at the Hotel Carlos down the block, Koenig came into play for Billy Jurgis. Koenig thought that he was instrumental in the Cubs making it to the World Series, but when the time came for divvying up the World Series loot, Jurgis got a full share and Koenig got half. Koenig complained to Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth started pointing out to Billy Jurgis, calling him a cheapskate. And, Charlie Root tells the story best. Charlie Root was asked by the producers of the Babe Ruth story, one of the worst baseball movies of all time. William Bendix, they had to reverse the negatives because he couldn't bat left-handed. He was asked by the producers, Charlie, do you want to come out and recreate that great moment, when Babe Ruth hit that home run off you? And Charlie Root looked at the producer and said, son, if I thought Babe Ruth was calling me out, I wouldn't have thrown it down the middle of the plate. I would have thrown it at his skull. True story.
Yep.
Charlie Root was a beanball pitcher, but I spend the time to debunk the story because, I think as it goes with a lot of baseball, there are facts and then there's fiction. And, I was there when the Cubs clinched against the Dodgers, as were 250,000 other people.
Right.
But I was there, So you have these stories that perpetuate, and coming from a journalism background, check it out. So I started fact-checking everything that was being done, augmenting the stories where appropriate, so it didn't come off sounding boring at the end of the day. You want to enthrall these people that are spending at that point $25 to hear you talk. You want to enthrall them into even a scintilla of the passion that you have for that place. And frankly, the fact that so many people come to Wrigley Field on a non-game day or on game day, they offer game day tours as well. And now we do them all year round.
Right.
So many people are there just to see that ballpark. I mean, that's quite a testament to Charlie Wiegman and the legacy he did.
Absolutely. And it's one of the few ballparks that are this way. You have fans of the White Sox, but you don't have too many fans of Guaranteed Rate Field. You've got fans of the Padres, but you don't have too many fans of Petco Park or whatever it's called today.
That's a nice little ballpark.
Yeah, sure, but how many people are walking around downtown San Diego wearing T-shirts that say Petco Park?
No, you won't find that.
Wrigley Field is that way. Yeah. Fenway Park is that way. Old Yankee Stadium was that way. There's just a handful, and maybe it's because they were the old ones and people have these lifetimes of memories associated with the ballparks. But Wrigley Field is a special place.
It's a weird thing about baseball fans, right? It goes beyond the love of the game. There's something amazing for me about stadia, period. Victory Field in Indianapolis, for example. You look at some of these ballparks or these fields, and while they may have different amenities, it's still 90 feet. It's always the quirks, the unusualness of the experience that makes baseball special. And I think the architecture of the game, and for listeners, look at the work of Philip Bess out of Notre Dame, who did a lot of work on stadia, and take a look at what he wanted to do with Armour Square, what Comiskey Park really should have been. This idea that we can keep some of the old park and we can face it the right way so fans could see downtown and all these different aspects of it. There are those of us who really, and I'm a member of the Society of American Baseball Researchers and have been part of their ballparks committee in the past, and there's just something special about these places that bring 40,000 people to one place 81 days out of the year. There's a spirit that goes along with it. I become a little less jaded about some of the newer ballparks than I was, I think, in the beginning. I think I've always been, I was a Wrigley snob and a purist, but, what you kind of do that about Chicago. You become a Chicago snob, but if you go to other places, there's some things that are better. And you just, but you want to bring them back home. Go to Baltimore and you go to the ballpark at Camden Yards, and they've got a washroom in the Oriole Club. There's a urinal that faces the playing field there's an architect out there with a sense of humor who said, you know what, I'm going to put a urinal that you can look out at the playing field in the Oriole Club. And for baseball stadium fans, those are things that amuse you, that someone took the time to not only think that through, but got approval from ownership to do that. That's
propose it.
It's great, but as I've gotten a little older, I don't take stadiums as serious. I do spend a lot of time looking at what makes them all interesting. I might have sound flippant about the ballpark in San Diego, but San Diego has done a great job of integrating a neighborhood experience with the ballpark itself, with a walkable park in left field over there. And it's interesting, that there's good urban design and urban planning in it. And frankly, I think that's what the Ricketts have done at Wrigley. I think to integrate an urban design, urban planning scheme over there will sustain that ballpark and make it profitable, not just 81 days out of the year, but 365 days out of the year. Ballparks that were built in the 70s and 80s that built big concrete parking lots around them and then ribbons of expressway, and maybe you could see the city that they represented, have missed the mark because stadiums only make money when people are in them.
Right.
And you don't need to talk to anyone beyond a bar that's across the street from the ballpark. When the ballpark is busy, the bars are busy. When there's nothing happening, those restaurants don't do as well. I think Detroit has got some of that figured out. If you go to look at how the Tigers have got themselves set up and how they've got where the Pistons play and things like that, it's integrated into downtown where you've got movement, you've got people, and you've got businesses that aren't going to have these ebbs and flows. And I think while anything we did at Wrigley Field is going to be controversial, Tom Ricketts has single-handedly sustained Wrigley Field for generations to come. Yeah. And I think that all comes from good urban planning, design, and I think his inherent love and definitely my love of stadia.
So back to your research, it turned into over 300 pages.
300 pages that I share. There's tens of thousands of pages of other stuff, yeah.
Your research has been quoted and referenced by writers and political columnist George Will in major publications, and everybody who wants to know anything about Wrigley Field has probably accessed your research or somebody who has accessed your research. Is your research still ongoing, or has there been a day, or will there ever be a day where you're just like, all right, I'm all done?
Wrigley Field is a living place. My work was based off the work essentially that Ed Hardig had done. Ed had done a lot of work on his end.
And Ed was the official Cubs historian.
Ed's the official Cub historian. Yeah. He does a great job. I've always looked at the quirks, though. The quirky stories and the stories that add life to the facts are just as important as the facts themselves. I'm always doing research on Wrigley. I think one of the more interesting things that comes out of tours is when I get a question that I can't answer, because that means it's a new area for me to research. Or when you find people that have a little piece of information that you didn't know. And I've been fortunate that there have been pieces that I've been able to codify after someone has told me a story that I've now integrated into the history of the ballpark. One of the often told stories about the ballpark is that we plan to have lights for the 1942 season. That fans know that Wrigley Field didn't get lights until 1988, but during World War II, Wrigley wanted to put lights up for the 1942 season, and he had ordered the lights, the ballast, everything that was needed in order to do that, and those were tucked underneath the right field bleachers. It was when the Cubs were redoing the dugouts that electrical workers found thick electrical cable that was going up the beams, and no one could explain why it was there. And I looked into it and was able to ascertain that Wrigley just didn't order the ballast and the lights. He had actually wired the ballpark for the lights, and they just never used it.
Mm-hmm.
That made the contribution that P.K. Wrigley did even that much more significant. The lights, the ballasts all went to Great Lakes Naval.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, George Herbert Walker Bush credited those lights for helping him learn how to land on flight decks when he was a naval pilot. But it added even more significance. And if you think about it from a business standpoint, you do this upgrade to your ballpark, you have everything wired and ready to go, and then there's a call of your nation, and Wrigley just voluntarily decided to say, it's got to go to the war effort. That's how complete that love was of God and country. Another story that was generated in part because of fans was a fan I knew was related to a Catholic priest that was the athletic director at DePaul, and had a story that somehow writers have missed for years that's now part of my lexicon. It was actually a Catholic priest who was frustrated largely because the 1913 Federal League was playing over at DePaul, that convinced Charlie Wiegman to look at the site of what used to be a Lutheran seminary to be the location of Wiegman Park, which would later become Wrigley Field. And the Catholic athletic director at DePaul was actually the guy who knew that land was available and also walked the path to show him where the ballpark could go. It's a little story, but it's an interesting thing about, well, how does it come to be that Charlie Wiegman decides to go over there? Well, Wiegman was being courted in 1913 to take over the Federal League in 1914, which he was convinced to do. But there had to have been a discussion over on Fullerton Street in Belden saying, he might have bought a ball team, but you're not going to be able to play your games here. Well, what am I going to do?
Right.
Well, I got some buddies down over at Clark and Addison, the Lutherans, and they used to have a site over there, and we can do it. There's actually more detail to that. The American Association had actually long conceived the idea of a ballpark at that location, and Wiegman, I think, when he put together the idea that there was land available of what used to be the Lutheran seminary site, along with the urging of the Catholic priest that this was a good idea, along with the lure of that being off the Northwestern rail line, which would later become the Red Line.
Right.
Put one and one together and got two. Wiegman, the site selection was brilliant, but it wasn't just him alone on that. And those are little stories that, you just don't find, but you have to have an inquisitive mind. You have to have a journalistic mind that you just don't put out a story until you can verify it.
Right.
And when you verify it, it becomes a lot of fun.
You and I know who Charlie Wiegman is and what the Federal League was, but I'm sure a lot of our listeners don't. So give me a brief synopsis of why a baseball team started playing, why they needed a park there, and then how the Cubs came into the picture after that.
Well, you got to set the Wayback Machine all the way back to 1913. And in 1913 Chicago, the Chicago Cubs were playing over at the West Side grounds, currently where the University of Illinois, more precisely the Illinois Medical District area, is down Taylor Street. And the Chicago White Sox were playing over at Comiskey Park, the baseball palace of the world, over at 35th and Shields. The Federal League was basically a lot of folks look at it as a semi-pro league, but it was a professional baseball league by 1914. 1913 it was semi-pro, but 1914, a group of guys, and they used to call them basically the lunchbox league. There were guys that were fishmongers and bread sellers and restaurant guys, all came together and said, you know what, we're going to create a third major league. But they were well capitalized, or at least so called, enough that they were able to look at guys like Walter Johnson and things like that. They were really trying to pull these guys off of...
They made an offer to Shoeless Joe Jackson.
Trying to make big commitments to a lot of these folks.
Right.
And Major League Baseball, at that time, organized baseball, was very concerned because these guys started poaching Major League ball players. And they basically put it down that if you decide to go to this third major league, you're going to be banned from the game. So while that threat was pretty heavy, the capitalization of these guys were drawing people to build ballparks in St. Louis, Indianapolis, Chicago, amongst other places. And as a result, ballparks were built, and the league played 2 complete seasons, 1914 and 1915. 1914, the Chicago Federals came in second place in the Federal League, and then in 1915, the Chicago Whales, and they renamed themselves, were the Federal League champions of 1915. They filed lawsuits because they felt that they were as legitimate of a league as the American League and National League, and they wanted the right to compete for a world championship, amongst other things. And that lawsuit, that federal suit, ended up in front of a guy by the name of Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Kennesaw Mountain Landis, rather than making a decision on that lawsuit, decided just to sit on it. And the longer you sit on a lawsuit, the more lawyers are involved, the more money's involved. And finally, it compelled them into settlement. And two team owners were basically able to buy into existing baseball franchises. Mm-hmm. One of those owners that were offered an opportunity was Charlie Wiegman. And the team for sale was the Chicago Cubs. The Cubs were owned by the Taft family of Ohio. The Tafts produce newspapers and politicians, including a guy named William Howard Taft, who was President of the United States, Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, but also known to be the fattest guy to ever be in the White House. In fact, he was so fat, when he stood up during the seventh inning of a Major League Baseball game in Washington, everybody stood up with him, hence creating the
seventh inning stretch.
Now that's folklore, but it's attributed to the career of William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft really should go down in baseball history as the first president to throw out a first pitch. Mm-hmm. Every American president has thrown one out except for Jimmy Carter, and Carter ironically put a softball field on the ballpark, and he was part owner of the Atlanta Braves
on the White House
grounds. On the White House grounds. So, but long story short, Wiegman was able to buy into an existing franchise. The Tafts owned not only the Chicago Cubs but also the Cincinnati Reds. And as a result, they were tired of owning two teams. They put the Cubs up for sale, and Wiegman, along with a consortium of men, which included J. Ogden Armour Meatpacking, mm-hmm. Armour Hot Dogs, and a chewing gum salesman by the name of William Wrigley. They got 7 other guys together, put some money together, bought the Chicago Cubs, merged them with the Chicago Whales, and then brought them to Wiegman Park in 1916.
The Tafts have a connection to Hotel Sinton in Cincinnati, which no longer exists, but that is the hotel where the Chicago White Sox stayed on the road during the 1919 World Series, which was the final, are we really doing this, you guys? Yeah, we're doing this.
Where the deal was brokered.
Yeah. So it was conceived at Hotel Buckminster, I believe, in Boston, but the final decision to, actually go through with it happened at Hotel Sinton.
And the building's still there.
It is no longer still there.
It's no longer there.
But it was until I believe the 1950s or 60s. So I've got some.
You got postcards or something like that?
I've got postcards.
There
I've got silver. I've got a teacup.
You're as crazy as I am about some of that stuff.
A little bit.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah,
that's nice.
So a lot of that stuff is going to go in the museum. I'm going to have a whole cabinet full of Hotel Sinton memorabilia and artifacts. So. Another Taft connection.
No, the Tafts were an interesting family. I mean, it's still politically powerful, still influential. And when you look at the legacy of what the Tafts did, it was pretty magnanimous for them to say, we'll just give the Cubs to, a charter member of the National League. We'll mm-hmm. just give those Charlie Wiegman and see what the hell he'll do with it.
Mm-hmm. But he was instrumental in changing the way baseball was viewed and consumed in American culture.
Very much so. And that really came out of the Federal League. I mean, it was Wiegman who came up with the idea of singing the national anthem mm-hmm. To be sung before ball games. He was a German during World War I. He wanted to show that he was a patriot, and what more way to do that than to sing the national anthem. He
was a restaurateur, right? So he came up with the first concession stand, full-time.
He came up not only with the first permanent concession stand, but he was the guy who came up with the idea of giving out premiums before a ball game. So the whole idea of pennants and hats and T-shirt day and all that, very much Wiegman. First premiums were discount tickets for his restaurants. Mm-hmm. So Wiegman understood a lot of that. Ladies' Day was a big part of Charlie Wiegman. He was very much an innovator in, unfortunately, when you have guys that are innovators, they fail in other parts of their business. Mm-hmm. And Wiegman rarely owned anything. Wiegman basically was promissory noted almost every week on what he was doing between his multiple restaurants and everything else. He was a very cash-heavy business. Mm-hmm. He had to borrow a lot in order to do it, and that kind of led to his downfall, that Wiegman was hemorrhaging money due to, first off, being a German during World War I. The influenza hit Chicago. There was a whole series of problems that Wiegman was having, and by 1918, William Wrigley took I hate using the word pity because I can't really see that with Wrigley, but Wrigley understood that there was an opportunity there. And,
there it is.
and started buying Wiegmann out, and eventually Wiegmann, unfortunately, would die nearly penniless at the end of his career. I think he died at the Drake Hotel in Chicago.
Oh, wow. So let's go over some of the research that you've done and talk about some of the iconic things that make Wrigley Field unique. The marquee that was installed in 1934, right? Originally green.
Originally a green color, and what eventually happened was the Bears really didn't like the whole idea of the green color with the Packers and things along that line. Mm-hmm. So the Wrigleys decided to make it the red color that we have today, and as a result, that is one of the few actual landmark parts of the ballpark. Mm-hmm. The Cubs cannot touch the marquee, they cannot touch the ivy-covered wall, mm-hmm. or they cannot touch the scoreboard. Everything else is free and open game at Wrigley to redo.
But they can make temporary changes, right? Because mm-hmm. in 2010...
we've added a message board underneath and
right.
things like that, but the sign itself is mm-hmm. considered sacrosanct.
Right. But over the years, it's been a number of different colors.
Purple.
2010, when the Northwestern Illinois football game was there. Painted green again in 2014 to commemorate Wrigley's 100th anniversary. So they got it back to the original color. So you can make some changes, but in the general structure and look and everything has to stay the same.
That's correct. And placement.
Oh, and placement too. Placement. Interesting. Okay.
And placement.
Let's talk about the scoreboard. Built in 1937.
1937.
And originally like a brownish color.
Yeah. Well, it was kind of a brownish red, and the problem with it, the scoreboard was built essentially. It's the most over-engineered part of the ballpark, at least during that time period. Bill Veeck had commissioned that work to be done, and it was so overwhelming that the guy who said he was going to build it couldn't finish the job, and Veeck had arranged to get guys to actually finish it. The scoreboard had a kind of a ruddy red color to it, and what happened was when the sun would hit it, it would reflect, and that was a problem for the batters. So it went to the military drab green that we have today. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think a lot of fans have talked about it being that P.K. Wrigley saw that there was surplus green paint, and he decided to take advantage of it with the whole idea that P.K. Wrigley was cheap. He really wasn't. He put a lot into that ballpark. But I've been in that scoreboard, and it's an amazing structure. For those who've gone into the bleachers or underneath the scoreboard, there's a small concession stand up at the top rear where you get beer. Well, above it is a latch and a small ladder that you climb up, and you climb up the ladder, and you can get into the actual scoreboard itself, and it is painfully simple. The scoreboard itself. There's multiple layers that you can go into there. There's a small workbench over there where signs are repaired or magnetic sheets are put over in case there are numbers that go beyond the number calls that mm-hmm. you would have for an inning, for example, as well as team names and things along that line. There are multiple openings in the scoreboard that you can kind of poke your head out so you can actually watch the game, and there's ventilation on the side. I would say that all in all, it's a magnificent place to work, but also a miserable place to work. The temperature, it's basically a Quonset hut, a tin shack built on a steel scaffolding. It's never been hit by a batted ball. The only ball to ever hit it was a golf ball hit by Sam Snead during a Father's Day exhibition. But the view is stellar. The view is absolutely stellar. But it can be miserably, I would almost go as far as to say stifling hot. But the guys that are in there, believe it or not, you have to be able to keep your score backwards in order to do that. Because as we're seeing it in regular, they know how to put the scores up backwards in order to make that all work. Mm-hmm. And it's all done in real time. It used to be done with there used to be a ticker tape that used to be in there, so they were able to know what was going on in real time across the league. Yeah. Now they just use their phones or actually an iPad. There's been some stories that they're going to do some repairs on the inside to actually make it a little more hospitable. It's really a tough place to work. There's no other way to put it.
On those 100-degree days in August with the humidity.
With no wind.
Right.
With no wind.
It's got to be, 120, 130 in there?
These guys can easily lose 10 pounds in water weight.
Yeah, crazy.
Yeah.
So scoreboard originally built in 37, then the clock got added a few years after that.
Yeah, for the 1941 season, they added the clock to help out the Chicago Bears. Essentially, was the idea. It's the only major addition to the scoreboard. We added an electric message board underneath during the 70s, but aside from that, the scoreboard is, for the most part, unscathed.
And then above the scoreboard are the flags that show the standings.
So there are 3 flagpoles up there, and what they do is they denote the standings in the National League. They're done in team order as far as the rankings are on a daily basis. On the top, the center flagpole is the American flag. Then underneath it are the 3 divisional masts. And if you look at the scoreboard, depending on the vantage point, it looks like the hull of a ship. Mm-hmm. And that was on purpose. So there's a very big nautical feel to the ballpark.
Absolutely.
in that regard. And the flags that we have around the ballpark, they're basically signal flags. So while people think the official flag of the Chicago Cubs is the win flag, that's just a signal flag. And by the way, it's white field with a blue letter. It actually used to be the other way around. It was a blue field with a white W was the way it used to be, but they reversed that over the years. But those are basically signal flags that we put up around the ballpark.
The flagpoles that show the standings, is that where they got the term pennant race?
I'll put it this way. It's one of the things that we attribute, yes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's your mother telling you that she loves you.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
okay.
right. That's right.
1937 was a pretty big year for Wrigley Field. So we've got the scoreboard. Then they installed the ivy that year.
Well, you got to install the walls first. So the permanent bleachers were put in 1937.
Okay.
Prior to 1937, we had stands out there and a brick wall out there, and there was a scoreboard that was at ground level in center field. But in 1937, the architectural firm of Halliburton and Root was brought in, and they built in the permanent bleacher walls and structure that we have there today. The original part of the walls with the ivy are original to 1937. The structure behind it have been redone a couple of times.
And the ivy was installed kind of in a time crunch, right?
No. I think, there's it's how it's said and it's how it's written. I mean, everything comes down to the word, right?
Yeah.
It's how it's said and how it's written. The way the story should be told is this. P.K. Wrigley had investors coming in to see Wrigley Field, and he had seen ivy down in Indianapolis and was aware of lush ideas of garden-type ballparks, including those that were out in the West Coast and the Pacific League. And he wanted to capture some of that idea at the ballpark. And he told Bill Veeck that he had investors coming in, and there was a short time crunch for those investors to get the ivy up as an idea. So there was a small section that was put up, not all the ivy in the entire ballpark. He was showing investors a small section, at which time Bill Veeck, along with the help of groundskeepers, Bobby Dorr and others, used Christmas lights to strand up the Boston ivy bittersweet that we have in the ballpark to show the idea. And after that was approved, then the ivy was planted throughout the whole ballpark.
Gotcha.
But that ivy that was put in around the entire ballpark during 1937 is the ivy that's there today. That's why we protect it. We don't use shears on it. That's all done with hand shears. Mm-hmm. It's an amazing effort. It takes them a couple days to do that.
Yeah, well, awesome. I guess let's talk about some of the things that Wrigley Field used to be known for. We kind of already hit about the lights, not having permanent lights until 1988, but there were instances where night games occurred at Wrigley before that.
The All-American Girls Professional Baseball League in 1943 was the first event.
July 1st, their All-Star game.
That's right.
Then September 12th, 1946, Jake LaMotta knocks out Bob Satterfield under portable lights.
That's right. So, and in fact, I've got actually the blueprints showing where the boxing ring would have been situated in that
where was
ballpark.
That?
Right over the pitcher's mound.
Okay, so did they... I guess they wouldn't have needed to flatten it out because it's raised up.
That's right.
Interesting.
That's
okay.
Right.
Because
the Sox did it the same way as well.
Cool.
You had professional wrestling there too, my friend.
Yes.
Gorgeous George defended his title not once but twice in the square circle there.
There was another event that happened in August of 1954. The Harlem Globetrotters beat George Mikan's U.S. All-Stars at night, and that court was set up between the pitcher's mound and second base.
That's right.
Okay. So when portable lights were set up, were they outside Wrigley? Were they inside Wrigley?
They were inside Wrigley, and they were positioned in the perimeter. I think the only way to frame it is if you've gone to festivals today, in parks and things like that, they were portable lights, generators and things along that line.
Yeah, interesting. What was the deciding factor to finally then install lights in 1988? Because they had gone so many years.
Well, the threat was Major League Baseball. Major League Baseball weighed in, and what they essentially said was, if you don't put lights in the ballpark, you're not going to be allowed to play any of your playoff games here at Wrigley Field. You're going to either play them over at Sox Park, or you're going to go play them in St. Louis, but you're not going to play them at Wrigley.
Interesting.
So it was a threat from Major League Baseball that you will not be able to dictate day baseball here, when our revenue generation is going to be at night.
And so then when they put them in, the first game was supposed to be 8/8/88, got rained out. Everybody knows that story. Did Major League Baseball reward them with the All-Star Game in 1990 because of the lights?
There was a whole series of things that had to be done to Wrigley Field. I mean, the lights were part of it, but in preparation for and in anticipation of an All-Star Game bid, we had to put in luxury suites. We had to build a new press box.
Okay.
And the patio deck that was built behind it, which is now gone now, but where the Catalina Club was, as well as some repairs and expansion of the visitors' locker room. And the visitors' locker room was a pretty small place even after they expanded it for the All-Star Game. But
imagine a football team getting dressed in that locker room.
Imagine a football team, full equipment, pads, and everything in a locker room that was about the size of maybe 600 square feet. My uncle played for the Vikings. And he said the conditions were absolutely miserable there. In fact, they would shower at the hotel rather than at Wrigley after they played, because Hallis wasn't into hot water for the opposing team. I mean, talk about home field advantage. I mean, that was the modus operandi. But yeah, the Cubs had to do massive infrastructure. The lasting infrastructure is really the press box, which is being redone for this season, and an expansion of the visitors' locker room and the inclusion of some 67 suites.
So somebody reading between the lines would say maybe the Cubs are redoing their press box because they're going to push for an All-Star Game coming up?
Oh, I think that's not even, it has to be inferred. The Cubs definitely want an All-Star Game.
We kind of talked earlier about the seventh inning stretch. Let's talk about Harry Carey and why the seventh inning stretch became so synonymous with Wrigley Field and Cubs baseball. Why did that happen?
Oh, it starts with Harry Carey, but it doesn't start with the Cubs baseball. It really starts with White Sox baseball. Bill Veeck had seen Harry Carey singing "Take Me Out to the Ballgame" and decided to drop a microphone and make it live inside the White Sox press booth, and then he decided to keep up with that tradition, and it was Harry Carey who brought that tradition over to Wrigley Field and made it what it is today.
Why do you think that tradition resonates so much with people?
Because the Cubs of that era, and nostalgia is a big part of baseball. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a game that we can all share and discuss generationally, because most of the facts and stats, up until the recent era, everyone could go back and pull to with a shared experience. And Wrigley Field is indicative of that great shared experience that we have. It's a place, Eddie Vedder said it, where your grandfather's grandfathers played. I mean, it's that kind of thing where you can trace history all the way back. My history with the ballpark goes back to 1933 when my grandmother played there. So you take a look at those things and you can always draw back to it. And nostalgia and WGN during that time period with Arnie Harris, those were the heart-pulling little kid with a hot dog going to the first game with your dad kind of thing. And the Cubs knew how to manipulate that very well. I think a lot of credit's got to go to John McDonough for keeping that going and keeping that spirit of nostalgia going. And I still believe nostalgia is an important part of Cubs baseball. I mean, we are one of the most traditional teams. I mean, the uniform has very modest changes over the last 60, 70 years, very modest changes. The ballpark pretty much remains the same, while there's changes around the ballpark. Since 1937, it's 400 to center, 355 and 353. I mean, that's what it is. Yeah. So there's a lot to draw upon, and while I think across the league there are a lot of throwaway ballparks and people wanting to upgrade and change and do things again and brand new and all this, nostalgia works at Wrigley.
You mentioned your grandmother playing. I was going to get to this later, but let's talk about it. So she played softball at Wrigley Field in 1933, and that was during the first ever international tournament of women's softball during the Century of Progress, the Chicago World's Fair. What did she say about it when she would tell you that story?
It's not just what she'd say, it's what she had left. Her knuckles were kind of, arthritis does these things, but so does playing softball. Her hands were always... she had problems with her hands because of playing softball. The recollections that she gave me, Grandma didn't talk about it much, but when she did, and you could draw into it, Her best experience was actually changing in the Cubs locker room. The girls actually were trying on the players' uniforms.
Wouldn't you?
Yeah, definitely. While they were in the locker room, it wasn't just a softball game though. It was the first international tournament of softball ever held. You almost have to put it at an Olympic level, because women played against women from across the globe, men played against men across the globe. And it was the team from Chicago with my grandmother playing that won the first international tournament of softball. So it really softball was very much a working class game in Chicago. My grandmother being of Polish descent, it was very much a game that neighborhoods played, and neighborhood baseball was big. It's an area, I think, of baseball research that could even use more attention, which were the Chicago baseball leagues that were some very, very competitive leagues that created Thillens Field and expanded upon a lot of the ballparks that we have around the city. But softball was a major sport, and Chicago was the capital of it.
Yeah. So you've got some other family ties to the Cubs.
Let me draw one thing from that,
yeah.
though. If my grandmother and that team doesn't play at Wrigley in 1933, P.K. Wrigley does not come up with the idea in 1943 for the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League.
Absolutely.
And in my career, I've had the opportunity to speak before various groups about Wrigley, but two speeches really stand out. One is in front of the folks from Catalina at Catalina Island, talking about Wrigley and the relationship between Wrigley and Catalina, which is omnipresent still to this day, and getting to speak before the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League alumni. And I did not disclose it that my grandmother played until the very end. And when you can make a group of hardened professional baseball players, doesn't matter if they're women or men, hardened professional baseball players, tear up a little bit that a grandson of one of those players was able to link why Wrigley Field is so important to the All-American Girls Baseball League. That was probably one of the high points of my baseball lecturing career.
Yeah.
But does not happen without it. When PK realized that he could fill the ballpark with women playing softball, it wasn't much of a jump to say, why don't we have women play baseball?
Well, like you were saying earlier about building up the neighborhood, all the properties are more valuable if you can attract people 365 days a year instead of 81. It's the same thing with this. If the Cubs are in there 81 times a year, that means we've got 284 other days where we can put something else in there and maybe make some money.
Well, it's always amused me, and I don't want to be harsh towards some of the baseball purists because I started that way, that you cannot change Wrigley Field. Wrigley Field is a perfect place, yada, yada, yada. But Wrigley Field has been a multi-sport facility almost since day one. You had everything from rugby to soccer to a hippodrome to professional boxing to professional wrestling. You had ski jump competitions. You had basketball. You've had hockey.
Political conventions,
religious revivals. You've had rock concerts. You've had all these different things happening at Wrigley Field.
Yeah.
And I think for a period of time with the Tribune especially, but arguably with the Wrigleys, that it just was a ballpark and that there were other facilities that were throughout the city. Why wrestle at Wrigley Field when you had the International Amphitheater or things like that? But the fact of the matter is that Wrigley has been a multi-sport facility, including the Chicago Bears, which is the biggest thing, right, since it was put into place. So I don't find it unusual that the Ricketts family and others in Cub Enterprises are looking at making that facility and that neighborhood viable throughout the year. I think that's, frankly, an area where the White Sox kind of missed the boat on that one. There are ways to make those facilities useful beyond just baseball.
Yeah, a lot of people know the story of Gale Sayers scoring 6 touchdowns in a game.
Uphill. The ballpark was crusted in the middle. We didn't play on a flat playing field until about 10 years ago.
But what I was going to say is most people don't realize that game didn't happen at Soldier Field. The Bears played at Wrigley for how many years?
Almost 50 years.
Right.
Yeah.
So people are like, oh, this great Bears performance. It must have happened at Soldier Field. It's an old place. No. That happened at Wrigley.
They were racing cars over at Soldier Field at that time period and playing the Prep Bowl there. They weren't playing professional football. And that was a handshake deal. I mean, that was a handshake deal between the Wrigley family and the Hallis family. Mm-hmm. And that sustained for 50 years. If we didn't have to move the field goal posts
from the front of the end zone to the back of the end zone.
To the back of the end zone, it's likely that there would have been a lot more football there.
Yeah. let's go back to some of your personal family ties to the Cubs organization and Wrigley Field. So Ernie Banks introduced you to your wife.
Yeah.
How did that, tell me that story.
Ernie Banks is one of the most interesting people you could have ever met in your life, and one of the hardest guys to talk about baseball with, because Ernie Banks never liked talking about baseball, but more importantly, never liked talking about himself.
Mm-hmm.
Ernie Banks would spend more time wanting to know what you did. So Brian, what do you do for a living? Well, wait a minute, I'm talking to Ernie Banks. I want to talk to you. Oh, what do you do? And what he would do is he would engage in intense conversation with you and get to know you, and then he would say, well, you seem to be a nice young man. Are you married? Hey, I just met this girl over here. She's not married. And I mean, I saw him hook people up left and right, and he couldn't have been a more delightful person. And Ernie made himself available to us through the auspices of Grant DePorter, Harry Carey's, to unveil the plaque that I put at the West Side grounds where the Cubs won their World Series in 07 and 08. And he and I did a number of stand-ups together and documentaries and things like that. But always a gentleman. One of the pictures I cherish most is a picture of Ernie Banks just sitting with my daughter. My daughter on his lap while he was talking to other fans. I mean, he was that kind of guy.
Yeah.
Ernie Banks, and I would argue Billy Williams is at this level. They were just sainted men and just knew their place in baseball history and didn't go into it with anything more than just a great zeal for life and a great appreciation for fans. And just knew how to make fans feel comfortable. That's a gift.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's a real gift.
Well, when you say about how he would kind of deflect conversations away from him, I would imagine every person from the time he was 16 years old only wanted to talk to him about his baseball career.
That's right.
So at a certain point, you probably get sick of talking about that and saying the same stories over and over. And tell me about that home run you hit. Why don't you tell me about what you did last week?
He and so many people. Ron Rappaport wrote a great book on Ernie. I urge listeners, if you're into Ernie, to pick that book up. But Ernie's post-baseball life is fascinating because he tried to dabble, like a lot of athletes in that era, to being the front person for a lot of different groups. You bring Ernie Banks golfing, or you bring Ernie Banks working in a bank, but Ernie Banks got involved in real estate. Ernie Banks got involved in a lot of things. His management of money, I think, was part of the downfall of that. And, he wasn't a sophisticated guy by any stretch of the imagination, but he wasn't a dumb guy. And Ernie Banks had such a huge heart. I mean, I never not saw him smile. I never saw him not be gentle and gracious, especially with small kids. I haven't thought about that element of him, but he was just a special, special guy. And, obviously after being with my wife for as long as I've been, that's the gift that keeps giving.
Yeah. You mentioned your daughter a minute ago. So she took her first steps.
My oldest daughter, I have 4 daughters, but
Okay.
My oldest daughter, Genevieve, took her first step in short center field just about 20 feet away from where her grandmother once played.
What was that moment like for you?
It was wonderful. I mean, you kind of plan for those things a little bit, and I was giving tours, and Genevieve was starting to pull herself up, and she was already doing those kind of things, so it wasn't too hard of a stretch that she was going to be in a position to do it. And her mother was on one side, and I was on the other, and she just started walking, and she didn't know what that moment was, but I definitely did, and her mom definitely did. Watching her grow up at the ballpark, it's a little different. I've got pictures of her generationally growing up in front of the ivy and her getting taller and bigger. And, she's still a Cub fan. She fell off the horse for a while, wanted to be a Sox fan for a while, but all children rebel at one point or another. But I'm not the only guy. I think there are a lot of people that live in Chicago that can point to different parts of Wrigley or different parts of that experience as being meaningful. I've just been able to be on the field and do things a little differently than some other people would, and I've been blessed to do that. I mean, my relationship with the Cubs is something I treasure with every breath I take. Well,
working at Wrigley, you have access like most people don't have. So what is your favorite part of the ballpark? And, you kind of talked about this earlier, but what is it like to be at the ballpark when nobody else is really there?
It's a family. a lot of people who work security and stuff like that. There's a lot of us are just temporary workers. I mean, we work the 81 days, or I work less than that. I give tours, but it's a family. I mean, there are those of us who have been with the Cubs and have stuck with the Cubs. We all know each other because we've been around there for so long. I mean, the younger tour guides will tease me that Brian was here when they planted the ivy. I'm 52 years old. I'm not old. I mean, we got retirees out there giving tours, and I'm the old guy. But
Right.
It's clearly a sign of respect, and I'm blessed for that.
So that's how you take that.
Yeah. These millennials. The reality is, a lot of us have just known each other for years.
Yeah.
I mean, I did my wedding there. I mean, these are people that, and social media has only exploited that even more. That
Right.
that a lot of us have become friends outside of the sphere, and it's going to sound really nostalgic, but it's a family. I mean, there's those of us who have been there for a long time. You encourage the new people coming in that this is a really cool opportunity. This is something that you're going to talk to your family or your kids about. That I used to work at Wrigley Field, and
Right.
I just stuck with it. I'm the bad penny that it's hard to get rid of. Because I've been there for so long, but I just love it so much. It's part of me.
Yeah, I've been bartending at Yaxie's for the past few years now, and getting ready to move to South Carolina. The thing that I'm going to miss most are my Cubs security guard regulars who come in after every game to come see me, and I spend more time with them than anybody else in my life. Honestly, more than my friends, more than my family.
It's the culture of baseball, though, isn't it?
Right.
It's the culture of baseball. I mean, unless you're part of that family in one form or another, you won't really understand it.
Right.
And it's the neighborhood bar, but on extreme. These people are part of your life. You're going through. I mean, you're hanging out at the ballpark. You're a security guy, and the ballpark is quiet, and you just kind of make sure everything is cool. Then you have 40,000 people. You go through the emotions of 40,000 people and whatever you had to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
You got to come down from that.
Right.
Those are big experiences, and I think baseball employees, more than anyone else, have to endure an awful lot to go through that experience. I mean, You're not going to find that in too many jobs where you have these, not only the massive people,
but the incredible roller coaster of emotions.
but the emotions that go along with it, and they are your regulars. I mean, it's hard for me to talk about Wrigley without Yaxie's, and it's not just a shameless plug. Yaxie's is a big part of my life. Opening day, I mean, you've seen me there for 20 plus years. Yeah. I have my own corner that even now the bartenders enforce. That's Brian's corner, and that's where Brian will be, and that's not yours,
right.
And it's family. And I think in a society where we're all fragmented, we cling to those things that are important, and we cling to those things that are known. And for me, that intersection of Clark and Addison, that environment that includes Yaxie's and the vendors that if you've ever been in the third base line on the upper deck, you have some of the most erudite and philosophical beer vendors you would ever think of in your life. I mean, these guys aren't just beer vendors; they're very well-read beer vendors that are philosophical and your ushers. You know when an usher's been there for 70 years and it's his birthday and he's married, or I mean, this is a different thing, and it's sports entertainment and it's fun.
Right.
But it's family. So you asked the question. That's how I feel about it. And, I'm fortunate that I have family in the front office too. I am the luckiest guy on the planet.
After the 2016 World Series, you were given a ring by the team. You're wearing it now. How often do you wear it?
I wear it if I'm in my professional life as a lobbyist. I'll wear it if there are expectations I'm going to wear the ring. Obviously I don't wear it when I'm walking down the street or anything like that, but it's a great reminder of something, and if you got it, you wear it. But not as often as some could, not as rarely as I probably should. I'll put it that way.
In your wildest dreams, as a kid, as a young adult, as a grown man, did you ever think that you would have earned a World Series ring with the Chicago Cubs?
I don't get too emotional about things like this, but I work hard to be a stoic. But when you get the call that you're getting not just a World Series ring, but you're getting the ring, and you're getting the same ring that the owner's wearing, and it's stunning. the generosity of the Ricketts family, the knowledge the Ricketts family has for people who have worked for the organization, not just for their tenure, but beforehand. The conversation points with the organization were, Brian, this isn't just for this season. Brian, you've been with us for a long time, but every expansion, everything we wanted to do, you were the first one there to help. It's an amazing validation, but it's humbling too. There's no more coveted piece of sports memorabilia on the planet, arguably, than a Cubs ring. I think my colleagues and peers in Boston may come to differ on that, but we both had a very shared experience in that regard. And to attain that level in something that you care about, that you're passionate about, is wonderful. And like I said, I'm the luckiest guy on the planet, and I'm forever thankful for it.
Yeah, absolutely. You were given that ring because of your relationship with the Ricketts. How did that relationship become so close that you were thought of to be given the same ring that they're wearing?
I've managed to make it through multiple owners there, and I think the relationship that you have with anybody, those are personal relationships, I think. But I'll say this: I think the Ricketts family, starting with Tom, going all the way through, recognize, and this is very clear that it comes from Joe Ricketts, they recognize hard work, they recognize sacrifice, they recognize effort, they recognize those things. And it's wonderful to be appreciated like that. And I wish everyone had the opportunity to know these people the way I do, and the way they treat people. This silver spoon idea of what the Ricketts family is, it's just not valid. Tom Ricketts was not born of a wealthy father. Joe Ricketts worked his rear end off and is no different than, in many respects, my own grandfather. Hardworking guy, blunt, direct, candid, worked hard for everything he got. And, by the time he came up with Ameritrade, all the kids were pretty much in college and stuff like that. So the Ricketts family are very Catholic. They're very middle-class values, and they treat people with genuine respect. There's a lot of admiration for them on that. And what they did for the organization and the amount of personal stake that they did, I think the Ricketts family will go down as one of the great Chicago families of all time.
Wow. You've played a huge role in keeping the history of Wrigley Field alive, but you also played a pretty major part in keeping the history of the West Side grounds alive. Can you give us a little brief synopsis of, first of all, what the West Side grounds were and why you felt raising money to have a plaque placed on that site was a worthwhile endeavor for you?
I used to be in charge of Taylor Street in Chicago's Little Italy in the near West Side. And I just, through my own baseball research, became acutely aware that the Cubs played there. And you start walking around the site. And there was a book that talked about lost ballparks. And usually when there was a lost ballpark, there was some kind of marker. Ebbets Field had one. There were other ballparks that had a marker. And Cubs won the World Series here in 1907. There's no marker here. What the heck's going on? And I had started.
We're a marquee franchise.
We're the first ones, I mean, I've sat on William Holbert's grave over at Graceland Cemetery. I mean, we're that's us from the beginning, right?
Right.
But the reality was there was no marker, and it always gets complicated because it's government ground. Mm-hmm. And I was fortunate to have a great partner and a Chicago police officer by the name of Mike Reichel, who also shared that passion. He was working on the project. He had some relationships with the news media. We both did. And he took the idea up again after I hit some brick walls. And, it's a simple Chicago story. You call the guy up and go, wait a minute, I was working on this too. Why don't we work on this together? And the next thing you know, I had a very good relationship with the Illinois Medical District Commission. We pitched the idea, showed them the history, and the IMD said, well, this is a good idea. We'll pay for this thing. We'll work with the university in order to do it. And ultimately, we were able to put the plaque up. We were able to have a grand event in order to do that. The Illinois Medical District decided to use the West Side grounds as part of their marketing as they were doing shows in biotech and things along that line. And, across the board with a few bumps along the way, it ended up being a a plaque that's still there. No one saw cut it for the bronze or anything else. I feel very good about that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know you're trying to get out of here, but I've got a couple more questions about you helping to plan the renovations of Wrigley Field with the Ricketts by knowing the history of the property itself, like understanding water tables and how deep you can dig before you hit Lake Michigan and stuff like that. Before this round of renovations over the last 7 years or so, what did you think of the in-game fan experience at Wrigley compared to other ballparks, and what did you think was the area that needed to be improved upon?
I think the overall fan experience at Wrigley is what you make of it. Hundreds of engineers and architects were all involved in the redevelopment of Wrigley. My role, I always like saying, is have you considered? And if you haven't considered, here's the background information that you should know. And again, when you have a guy and a team like Tom Ricketts has put around them that are open to hearing suggestions and they're accessible, it makes a project better.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, the parts that I played with the organization, whether it be public testimony or an idea here or there, are just indicative of great leadership that comes again from the top from Tom. It says fan experience. I'm always careful, and you're going to watch me straighten my back a little bit and my tone change a little bit. But fan experience is always going to bump up into nostalgia. The experience that a fan has of going to the ballpark in the 70s is different than what they had going into the 80s, which is different than it was in the 2000s, which is different than it is now.
And it's funny because people think whatever their experience was when they were 12 years old is how Wrigley has always been. And it's just not true.
It's just not accurate. But you want to keep the core things. And again, when you have people challenge, it disappoints me, and you'll hear that tone in my voice. I'm always disappointed when people look past what the family and the organization have done surrounding that ballpark to improve the amenities around there. They're making that place viable for 365 days out of the year. They're making those bars and restaurants viable for 365 days out of the year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's going to be some changes. There's redevelopment that's happening around those areas because there's a lot of positive energy coming out of that ballpark that says it's going to be a neighborhood center, a core for 100 years or more.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of fan experience visually, arguably, with the exception of the scoreboards in left and right, it's essentially 1937. That playing surface essentially is the same since 1937, except for that it's level. Right. Talk to anybody who, if you're around visitors, around the opposing teams, heck, that dugout's pretty much the same. You know, I mean, there's a lot of it has remained the same. So from the player's experience, player amenities are better.
Mm-hmm.
From the fan experience, I would love to argue with someone about and have someone explain to me how the upper deck is worse off now than it was just 3 years ago. That you can now find a bathroom.
Right.
That you can now get a hot dog in the upper deck.
How dare you make this more enjoyable for me?
You know, that you can have access to
Right.
beer and craft beer. And for those of you who have sat up there on an April or May when it is freezing on the first base line, that all you have to do is just get up, go out to that deck where the sun is going to be warm and you can warm up outside.
To endure 7.5 more innings
of drinking beer in paradise. I mean, you know, and I don't want to be facetious about this, but
right.
I mean, if you look at the Ricketts family has expanded the ability for you and the ease for you to get to amenities alone, that the opening of the gate off the plaza, I mean, that you can go in and out of the ballpark with a stamp. I mean, these are things that no one would have ever even thought imaginable before. Right. And now it's all there. I think the fan experience for this generation of fans is going to be more modern, but the viewing experience is going to be the same that they had, that their parents had, that their grandparents had, that their great-grandparents had. The slope of the seats, still the same. The angle of the seats, still the same. And if you're fortunate enough, you might still have the same tour guide or the same usher because they're still there. So, and the value comes out on the field itself. The more accessibility to food, the ease of getting it means more revenue. More revenue means better players, period.
Were the biggest challenges of the rebuild structural, or were they sentimental? Like, meaning trying to maintain the integrity of the atmosphere, of the old building when you're operating under such tight constraints about, like, first of all, you've got a very limited amount of space because you're bounded by streets.
You're wedged in.
You have to keep the scoreboard. You have to keep the ivy. You have to keep the marquee. There's only so much you can possibly do. So what were the biggest...
There was more of a process, more of a process to this. I think you'd have to talk to an architect to explain what they were able to do and how they were able to do it. I would challenge it and just say that essentially everything they did was very... You have architects like John Vinci working on this thing, Gunny Harborough and all these guys, preservationists deeply engaged in this one, that structurally they were able to change things and maintain, again, the slope and the views. They're identical. They just were able to upgrade and repair.
Mm-hmm.
I think from a landmarks and governmental side, getting past sentiment and nostalgia was a huge battle, because there is the idea of Wrigley and then there are the facts of Wrigley, and they are often not in the same space.
Yeah.
The idea that Wrigley Field has never been changed is bunk.
Right.
It's just not accurate. It's not factually accurate. There's just nothing. There is no compelling evidence that says that it has not changed. All the evidence is it has changed. It has changed significantly over time. Things that you thought have never changed, they did.
Yeah.
And they changed many times, and they're well documented changes. It's just that we care to fall into nostalgia or this idea that change is bad. And when we go down that path of change is bad, Wrigley Field stops being at Clark and Addison and ends up being in Rosemont.
Was there ever a time when that was a serious consideration?
Oh, I think it was very close. I think it was closer than people think it was. I mean,
what kept the Cubs there then?
Tom Ricketts.
Mm-hmm.
Tom Ricketts kept the Cubs there. The Cubs organization could have easily shut down the ballpark for rehab, and they could have played half their games in Milwaukee, half their games at Sox Park, and said, we're going to redo it in one fell swoop. Tom Ricketts said, no, we're going to do it incrementally, even though it's going to cost me more. We're going to do it incrementally. We're going to work with the city. I'm going to pay for it myself. Go across baseball and tell me where there wasn't subsidies and government money loaded into those projects. Tell me the last time the White Sox paid rent. Yet people want to go after Tom for putting his own money and investing in the neighborhood and building it. I think it's outrageous. I think the Ricketts family put their money where their mouth is. They've proved up their commitment that they were going to protect, preserve, and improve Wrigley Field, that they were going to be good community partners, and that they were going to provide a world championship team. Check mark, check mark, check mark. They've done it, and they're still doing it. I mean, there hasn't been a time that I've gone to Wrigley Field, as someone who's been part of that organization since 1998, that work wasn't being done on that ballpark, and work is being done at that ballpark today. They're always working to improve that ballpark and its amenities.
Why do you think it's important to save these old ballparks like Fenway Park? There's the famous story that during the 1999 All-Star game at Fenway, that was supposed to be basically a farewell party. And when people realized this is something worth saving, it got saved. Why are places like Fenway and Wrigley Field worth saving, and what are the costs that people don't understand about doing that?
Oh, I'm going to give you I'll answer it differently. Name me another place that's worth saving in baseball. You can't.
They're all gone.
You can't.
Yeah.
That's why.
Yeah.
Why is there always going to be so much interest in Wrigley Field and the Chicago Cubs? Because it's the number 2 or number 3 tourism draw for the state of Illinois. Because people want to go there. It's a destination location. And in places where the world is temporary, where everything about what we venerate is temporary or can be removed, these are buildings that have created not only a sense of place, but a neighborhood of place. And the economic engine that is Wrigley Field and the Chicago Cubs is absolutely overwhelming. To think about that space as condos. And are you going to be able to support all those bars, restaurants, and everything with condos there?
Right.
Absolutely not.
Right. Are
all of those things so easily movable? Even when the Yankees redid Yankee Stadium, They were smart enough to do it in the same neighborhood. I'll give the White Sox credit on it. They were smart enough to do it in the same neighborhood because the White Sox were at risk of moving as well, right? They were going to Florida. They realized that there was an important linkage. And this idea that sports teams don't move. Talk to people in Indianapolis about that.
Montreal.
Talk to people in Montreal about that. And then and then they're all crying that Cleveland. Yeah. Talk to those cities.
Right.
Talk about the fact that teams can be drawn out of places. Look at Los Angeles and the Raiders. Look at all these teams. And this idea that it can't happen here.
Until it does.
Is just ludicrous. The Ricketts have done a tremendous job of reinvesting. And yeah, change is difficult. But you know what? It's still here.
Is there anything that we didn't get to that you would like to have touched on?
I think the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum is getting a great executive director.
Thank you so much.
I think the commitment to what is past are great avenues for teaching us what can be ahead. I tend to be a scholar, not just baseball stadiums, but I think you get to a certain part in your life where it's important to read the classics. And I'm a big fan. I named my company Aurelius Public Affairs after Marcus Aurelius. And the one thing that you learn, whether you read Marcus Aurelius or even the nature of Shoeless Joe Jackson's career, human nature doesn't change. Aurelius wrote his book 2,000 years ago, and human nature doesn't change. But you can learn from you can learn from experiences, and you can learn from how we've moved or changed as an era. But I always remind people, as much as the game changes, it's still 90 feet. And I think the work that you do in perpetuating baseball history, no different than Garkey does with Little Wrigley Field out in Freeport, Illinois, or all these other things, reminding us that as Americans, the national pastime is supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be something we can share generation to generation, that there are compelling stories that are worth sharing again and again. I think about folklore an awful lot when I talk about baseball, and I always tell the stories about Johnny Appleseed or George Washington throwing the silver dollar across the Potomac. That's no different than the Babe Ruth called shot story in many respects. But sports is where we find folklore most active. And to share those stories, to identify what is folklore versus truth, to identify in a more erudite way why decisions were made, or what education was like that led to those decisions, that puts Shoeless Joe in his situation. I think it's important. So I think you're a gift not only to the museum, but moreover, a gift to that region. It's a beautiful part of the country. I urge people to go see the drive down there, the Greenville Drive. It's a great community down there. I urge people to go to Wrigley Field. Wrigley Field is a special place. I urge people to take a tour. There's still, I think, $25. I haven't checked the rate card on it. I've never looked at a pay stub.
Depends on the tour you buy.
I've never looked at a pay stub in my entire career there. I think I framed my very first one, and I've never looked. I mean, do they pay me? I don't know. But I urge people to take a tour. But I think I also urge people to look deeper into whatever they're into. I think the reason why I have a World Series ring is because I followed my passion in the game and I took it to the highest level possible.
Yeah.
And I think when you do that, you may surprise yourself that you will find others, especially in this time of social media, that there are other people who are just as geeked out and weird as you are about whether it be baseball or I can't do a show. Whether it's, if there's a microphone in front of me, I got to always talk about Svengoolie, the great horror film host, of which I'm an aficionado as well. But social media has the opportunity to bring people together and not divide. And when you find that there are groups of people that are into Shoeless Joe Jackson or Wrigley Field or baseball history, Chicago history, or whatever you're into, take a moment and dig deeper into it, because I think you'll find that there are others that like it, and your own education and ability to learn will grow from it.
So where can people find you on social media if they want to get in touch with you or follow what you're up to?
They can find me on Twitter at Brian Bernardoni, at BrianBernardoni. You can find me and follow me on Twitter. On days I'm giving tours, you'll always see a picture of the ballpark first thing in the morning when it wakes up. And that's the best place to find me.
Yep, those are some of my favorite posts.
Thanks.
One last question.
Yeah.
You've got a time machine. You can go watch one game in baseball history. Where are you going?
Oh, I want to see the called shot. I want to know the truth for myself. Supreme Court Justice Stevens was there for it, and he says it happens. Lou Gehrig said a couple days later, the big monkey called his shot is what he said. I'd love to have been in a seat where I could see it, just to see, did he really call it or not? I mean, I dispute it. I think he was pointing out to Billy Jurgis and calling him cheapskate. I mean, that seems to be where the stories go. And Babe Ruth, you ask him one day, he would tell you one story, and the next day there was a different story, which is what makes him great, right? But
just adds to the folklore.
Just adds to the myth. But the called shot, I mean, the 500th home run of Ernie Banks, that's great. Kerry Wood's 20 strikeout game, all those things are great. But man, I want to know the truth of that one. I mean, it's just, those are the kind of things where I think. Here, we can go 1 second on this. If there is videotape of every single flipping thing we do now, there is a digital, there is an electronic thing of everything we do now.
Almost to a scary degree.
No, it's not almost. It is to a scary degree.
Yes.
I got to remove the tinfoil hat I've got on right now, but I mean, they're watching us. They're everywhere, right? But the fact of the matter is, those were the things that we needed to see.
Right.
Did Babe call a shot or not? But I think that's what's great about the game, too, though, that there are some questions that are just never going to be answered that add to that great debate. There's so many of these things that have been these great debates. How fast really was Jesse Owens? How can you talk about what baseball would have looked like without knowing what Rube Foster was like in the Negro League?
Right.
Double Duty Ratcliffe. Were they as good as everyone said? What were those teams like?
Right.
And how wrong we were.
Well,
how wrong we were about, I mean, how would the game have changed? This is a podcast in itself.
Yep.
How would the game have changed if Rube Foster and all these guys got into play in the major leagues right out the gate? What would the game look like today?
Well, let's go back and ask Cap Anson why he kept those guys out.
Well, without a doubt. What would the game have been like? But that's what's fun about it. You've got one set of stats versus another. You've got analytics on both sides going, well, this, but that, but this, but that, but this, but that. And there's so much we miss, but I think that's why baseball history is so important. Mm-hmm. How legitimately good was Shoeless Joe Jackson? Was he as pure of a hitter as people said he was? Here, put it on the table. What about the Cubs and their role before the Black Sox? Mm-hmm. And what did that really look like?
Right.
And what was that coverage? And how much did Ring Lardner really know about what was going on back in those days?
Mm-hmm.
Beyond, and those are just in sports, but Time Machine's scary because it leads to more questions than answers, but that's why there's an internet machine. That's why there's still card catalogs. That's why there's still old newspapers to track down, like I do, about Federal League stuff. Just what was another person's read on this? I mean,
right.
The scary thing about the internet in this regard is it really does limit you to what your scope is. Because if it doesn't exist on the internet, it doesn't exist. Well, that's not true. Try and find archives of the Chicago American,
right,
or the Chicago Sun, or the Chicago Herald Times, or all these the Herald Record, or all these things. Going through those old tapes over at the library, it's not easy. They're not easy to read. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't mean they don't exist. You just got to go find them.
Right.
And remember, history is always written by the winners, mm-hmm. but there's still another side.
Always.
And I think, again, that goes to why the work that you're going to be preparing yourself with Shoeless Joe Jackson is so important, and why I think history always has to be looked at and talked about when it comes to Wrigley Field. Because if we don't pay heed to the lessons of history and observe what's going on, things can get taken away from us pretty quick.
I completely agree. Thank you so much for all the kind words
and
for sitting down.
No.
I will come back in 5 years and we'll do this conversation in the Cubs History Museum that will be attached to Wrigley Field somewhere.
I hope so.
And the basis of which will be your personal collection.
I appreciate that.
Because that stuff needs to be in a museum.
Well, hopefully I make it down to see family over in Greenville, and maybe we can do another podcast just of the observations of the beautiful Shoeless Joe Museum.
Sounds good.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. All right, now it's time for a segment called What Did You Think, Mom?, where we talk to my mom who just listened to this interview with me, and we ask her what she thinks. This is my real, actual mom. Her name is Lori, but I've always just called her Mom. Can you say something to prove that you are my mom?
I'm just going to help you fact check right now. Your mother does love you.
Funny. So what did you think of the Brian Bernardoni episode?
As a born and raised Chicagoan living in the south suburbs, so I still consider myself a Chicagoan, though I guess I'm more of a suburb girl. There were a lot of interesting things that Brian had to say, not only about Wrigley Field, but about aspects of growing up and living in Chicago. So one of the first shout-outs I want to give when he was talking about having Jack Brickhouse be his babysitter. And, of course, that was for so many of us. I'm 10 years older than Brian by listening to what he had to say. And he talked about not only being babysat by Jack Brickhouse, but Vince Lloyd and Lou Boudreau. So I was born and raised in Harvey, as were my parents, and I have to just give a shout out that Lou Boudreau was from Harvey, Illinois. That's the only positive thing we can now say about Harvey, Illinois. But Lou Boudreau was the man, and there would be Lou Boudreau days and everything else. So he was a real big star out of Harvey. The next thing I want to say is that Brian referred to Dave Kingman as his number 10. And at first I didn't get what he meant by he was my number 10. And then when he described it a little bit more, when he was adoring Kingman at Kingman's feet the first time he got to meet him, and I'm not saying I wouldn't have done the same thing, and I realized, that's how I know I'm 10 years older than him, because I could not think of anybody else other than Ron Santo being number 10. Mm-hmm. And not that I was a huge Cubs fan growing up. I was an okay Cubs fan, but I wasn't raised in a real sport-minded family. So my dad was Cubs and White Sox. My grandparents' house was right next to Rube's Sportsman's Club in Harvey. And there was always a lot of activity. There were names of players who would be popping in there, and Rube's would put together buses that would go to Cubs games or Sox games. Mm-hmm. It wasn't one or the other, it was both. Though I guess probably more Sox games. So sorry, I guess if I had to fill out a form that said, who's my number 10, I'm going to have to go with Ron Santo.
Well, I think that's what Brian's point was, is that Ron Santo is most people's number 10.
Yeah.
And, his number is retired. He's got a flag flying in Wrigley. So if you identify Kingman as your number 10, like, you're in the minority. And so I think that's why when he said that to Dave Kingman, he was immediately like, oh, you want to go have a beer?
Because it's you.
Right. Not only am I the president, I'm also a member. So yeah.
But I think it has to do with who you adored while you were younger.
For sure.
For me, Randy Hundley, I was a huge, I've always loved catchers, as you know. Mm-hmm. And Randy Hundley was my first guy. So the time I remember being in Wrigley Field for the first time was probably in May of 1970, I think. And with my dad, who was a chaperone, it was the crossing guards going from Little St. John Baptist School. And it was a beautiful day. And I remember walking through and seeing the grass be so green. I don't necessarily remember the ivy, but it was just so bright and sunny.
In May, the ivy wouldn't have been in full force.
Right. But even so, I don't know that how much I was even aware of what I should have even been seeing or, And I have a memory of course, every kid who goes to a baseball game, you want to get an autograph of something. That's not going to happen for the majority of the people who are in the stands. But I remember, because we were with a group of kids, and my dad was just one of the chaperones, but most people didn't have their dad with them. I was lucky in this way. My dad worked nights, so daytime things, he could go with us. And he knew I would have loved to have had an autograph or something. And I remember at one point he had gone to a concession stand or whatever, and when he sat back down, he took my hand and he put it in his pocket, and he bought like a signed ball. And that was it. I mean, I had that signed ball on my dresser in my bedroom until probably I moved out when I got married, and that's not a lie. So, but you compare the feel of Wrigley Field to, as Brian called it, Sox Park. Mm-hmm. It was Comiskey.
It was known as Sox Park for a handful of years, yeah.
Always, right. Yeah. And then the ridiculousness of it, of guaranteed rate and 3/5 and 5/3 and
U.S. Cellular Field.
Even that, it was just like, to me, abhorrent, the same way
Yeah,
renaming the Sears Tower is.
How dare you name a ballpark after, a brand? You want it to be something like Wrigley Field.
Timeless.
After.
Well, yeah, I'm there with you. You got me on that one.
But for real though, I mean, it was a gum brand, and a company, but it was the guy,
Right.
So people don't have that same association as it's not a corporate naming rights issue.
Especially when it's a revolving door with that.
Right.
So my thing is the Sears Tower. And yes, Sears sold it and whatever, and then you have Willis, and now they're not there either. So what? You have this iconic structure, and it just...
But if I were the Sears and Roebuck company, I would have done the exact same thing. You're going to charge me to put my name on a building that everybody calls anyways. Why would I pay? You can put whatever name you want on that thing. Everybody's going to call it the Sears Tower for the end of time.
Well, that's another discussion that we'll just all have to have. But yeah, I don't know. I find that most lifelong Chicagoans are going to call it Sears Tower just because that is what you need to call it. I want to go back to Sox Park, though. When I think of Sox Park, I don't think of it as being sunny. I think of it as being just darker, even if it was a sunny day. And I'm talking about really Comiskey Park, not U.S. Cellular.
Right. Well, Greg Kreinler talked about that in his episode where when he painted the opening day no-hitter from Bob Feller was like, yeah, you got the painting right because that place was dark and drab. And
right.
So
right.
It seems like that is a common theme of...
Though Feller talked about that day was overcast, right? And I'm saying it didn't matter if it was overcast or not because I just remember being underneath the upper deck, I guess, and you had poles all over the place on the lower level and the smell of cigars, which I loved. And whenever I smell that smell today, I don't know how many decades has it been since I was in Comiskey Park, but that smell is what I always think of. So just a completely different feel than the sunny, happy Cubs. One other thing he talked about that's so Chicagoan, he took up his idol's swing, which was problematic, and he didn't correct it until he was playing softball. He hesitated when he was saying those words, and in my mind, I finished for him and said, in Grant Park, and then he said, in Grant Park. And if you ever go to Chicago, I know a lot of the fields aren't there the way they used to be, but all of my growing up and high school and college, and when I worked downtown, right downtown outside of Grant Park for years, those fields would be lit up at night. It was covered with softball fields, and every professional young guy and the guys who thought they were still young, they'd go straight from work over those softball fields, and they would always talk about the major injury in an ER during summer were the smashed fingers, because it was generally no glove and 16-inch. And that was such a Chicago thing of having that wide diameter ball.
Yeah, Mr. Malinowski tells stories all the time about being on teams where, like, they had fans.
Oh, definitely.
It wasn't just their friends and their family and their wives and girlfriends. It was people who wanted to go watch competitive softball.
Right.
And that's a Chicago thing.
Yeah, definite part of the culture. And I was downtown within the past 2 years where I had an overview of Grant Park, and the fields aren't there the way they used to be. And I thought, it's just a part of the culture that's lost.
Something that Brian mentioned when he was talking about specifically giving tours at Wrigley was being able to codify stories that other people have told you to then be able to use on your own tours. And I think that's a cool point. That's something that we do at the Shoeless Joe Museum when somebody asks a question, like Brian mentioned also. His favorite questions are the ones that he doesn't know the answer to, because then that gives him a chance to go research something and find out. And maybe he doesn't ever find the answer, but normally you do. So that's something that we run into also. Right.
And the thrill of the hunt is what makes it so great. And then you can share it with future people who come through. He was just a wealth of information, just so many things, even though I'm born and raised there, just wasn't aware of.
Or a lot of stuff that just doesn't dawn on you because you've never really needed to think about how did the Cubs franchise come to be?
Right.
I know that you weren't just talking about baseball, but other Chicago things that he talked about. But when he mentioned like Kennesaw Mountain Landis and him being a judge beforehand with the jurisdiction that he did that was so favorable towards the American League and the National League owners, making him the commissioner, that was such a major factor that they were like, oh, this guy's going to take care of us, then we'll put him in charge.
Right.
And so Obviously that then tied into Joe Jackson because Kennesaw Mountain Landis was the commissioner that banned all the Black Sox players. But even still, those little tidbits are things that you wouldn't really think about unless you set up the timeline and talk about the stories in a chronological order and realize like, oh, okay, this is why this happened.
Exactly. And when you think about no matter how big the world is, it's really not. There's a saying like all politics is local that flows to that. So when you hear the names of the players, and I don't mean the ball players, I'm talking about the players in a situation, and then you find out, oh, they have history already, and it's really no surprise of how that advanced. I liked when he was talking about the handshake deal between the Wrigleys and the Hallis family, two Chicago families and two guys who were patriarchs. And for 50 years, they have the handshake deal, even though Soldier Field is there and is this monster structure. But no, we're okay with Wrigley Field, and because that's who they were. So that was, I didn't realize that was why the Bears played there.
We were talking earlier about the political families, and he mentioned the Tafts.
Right.
So during the interview, I didn't go into all this detail, but the connection to the Sinton family of the hotel. So Hotel Sinton, I mentioned that during the interview, it stood in Cincinnati from 1907 to 1967. David Sinton was born in Ireland in 1808 and became one of the wealthiest people in America. So much of his fortune was made by stockpiling pig iron and then waiting for the American Civil War and then selling that iron at inflated prices. So he became a multi-millionaire at the time. And so he had two children, one of whom was Anna Sinton. She married U.S. Representative Charles Phelps Taft, who is the older brother of William Howard Taft, the president. So when David Sinton, her father, died on August 31st, 1900, he died in Cincinnati, and he left her $20 million in 1900. So today, that's like $543 million. So that's what she got in the will. And he was Ohio's richest man.
Thank you, Daddy.
Right. He was Ohio's richest man by far at the time, and the Hotel Sinton was named after him. So that was the Taft connection that I touched on in the interview, but those are the details of it.
Whenever you hear those big numbers, you hear it with the robber baron families. It's all pre-income tax because the Income Tax Act didn't hit until 1913. So they were able to just amass these fortunes scot-free, basically.
Right.
Another tie-in that had no clue about this was when he talked about his grandmother playing softball at the Century of Progress, which was 1933 and 1934 in the city of Chicago, and how when he was able to see that happen, and then how Philip Wrigley saw that happen and saw then
seeing a bunch of people in the stands watching women play softball gave him the idea that, okay, well, maybe I can fill the stands when the Cubs are out of town with women playing baseball.
Right, and then set it up for A League of Their Own, again, the movie tie-in, and so it just adds another layer to the understanding of what exactly was going on. I don't think that they ever referred to that fact about the 1933 Century of Progress situation.
Yeah,
so.
not in the movie.
Right.
Brian does a good job of talking about all of the different things that Wrigley Field has hosted over the years, and if you think of it as just a ballpark that now is starting to host concerts, you're just off base. No pun intended. There have been so many different things that have happened, and if you're following along online, I show pictures and give links that you can do some more extensive research on some of the other things that have happened. But just wild events, rodeos, and when Brian mentioned the Hippodrome, that was one thing that I couldn't find a picture of. It happened in, at least there was one in 1915, from like June 12th to at least through July 4th, when the Cubs had an extended road trip, and Charlie Wiegman brought in a Hippodrome, which is basically like an amusement park / circus type of thing. So there have been all sorts of events at Wrigley Field, and a quote that Brian said during the interview was, "The ideas of Wrigley Field and the facts of Wrigley Field are different because of nostalgia. And just because you remember something a certain way doesn't mean that that's how it always has been." And
Right.
I think that his knowledge and the details that he goes into really shed light on that.
Right, and that was, I think, the precursor for the United Center. They always have the circus trip. So the Blackhawks can't play because the circus is coming to town around Thanksgiving. One of the things he talked about was, again, about the Bears and he talked about how Gale Sayers, who was a great iconic player for the Bears in the 1960s, and how he had a 6-touchdown game, and how everyone assumes that occurred in Soldier Field, but really it occurred in Wrigley Field. And he mentioned about how it was uphill, and that I wasn't aware of either.
So this has more to do with the way that drainage systems were back then. So before there were all these modern drainage systems where a field could be perfectly flat, and then if it rains, there's pipes and drainage tiles and everything underneath the field that carry the water away and make the field as dry as quickly as possible. They would have a crown to the field, so it would naturally disperse the water to the warning tracks and out from the field of play. So during a baseball game, and it's not a huge slope, everybody's backyard has a slope to it too. It's gradual, and it's just enough to make the water drip. So at most, you're talking a 6-inch slope over a 50-yard stretch of land, but it's technically uphill,
Right.
So when the Bears were playing, until you get to midfield, halfway you're running uphill, and then halfway you're running downhill too. But I think that was the reference there.
Oh, no, I think it was uphill both ways. One other thing he talked about was the site of the West Side grounds, where the Cubs really had fantastic glory years. But that is in such an area where I'm sure Cubs fans who think they are the loyalist Cubs fans in the world probably have no clue that site existed. And to think that it didn't have a marker there until 2008 is such a shame. I'm glad it's there now, and it's a fantastic marker. And now it's on my list of things to go check out next time I'm back in Chicago. To honor those spaces. I mean, all around us, wherever you live, there are going to be sites that you're going past every day in your daily life, not realizing what major thing might have happened there. And
that's what we're trying to do here in Greenville with the Joe Jackson baseball fields and some of the homes that he lived in. You and I only know these things because we've done research for the past X number of years, and we are into that kind of stuff. So we enjoy hunting down the history. But some people live in those houses today and don't know that they live in, they don't know who Joe Jackson is, and they don't know that he's from Greenville, and they don't know that he lived in their house.
Right.
We're trying to change that.
Right. And kind of respect the place. And I don't mean the place of the house, but the space. Respect the space and kind of give it sometimes the honor, sometimes the infamous designation. But it's up to the historians to keep it, because in another 50 years, forget about it. You know, the sources are gone and whatever. And that's what we run into with Shoeless Joe Jackson. It's so hard when there aren't that many sources to begin with, and then they just fade away, especially when you get to the internet age. So
what was your favorite thing about the Brian Bernardoni interview and episode?
Well, I can say for my best friend in high school was a crazed Cubs fan. And so I guess on Renee's behalf, I'm going to say I love that he talked about Mr. Cub, Ernie Banks, really being the stand-up, decent human being, compassionate, kind man. That was the perception. When so many times your heroes, when you get to know them really, they may have clay feet instead of wings. It's nice to know that Ernie Banks had wings.
Yeah, I've talked with so many people in media or fans or people who've had business dealings with him over the years. I have never met a single person who has a bad word to say about Ernie Banks.
Yep.
For somebody who lived, 83 years or something, he lived a life and went through the things that he went through. He started in the Negro Leagues, and not a lot of people understand that or know that. He could have very easily been a bitter old man, and he wasn't. He was, like you said, the idea that everyone had of who he was supposed to be is who he was. Anything else you have to add?
No. I need to go see where the West Side grounds, and I need to go take a tour with Brian.
Yeah. At the end of the page, I'm going to put up a link to a YouTube video that somebody took taking a tour with Brian. So if you want to get part of it, you can do that. But otherwise, absolutely, when baseball is back in town or in session, I think they do some tours before games, but then that's the goal of Wrigley Field year round, is to always be giving tours, always do things. Like we said, you can't make money on an empty ballpark. So even when the Cubs aren't in town, that's what they're trying to do is always have something going on. So yeah, go check out a tour. They're very cool. I've got a couple pictures up on the site of from when I took a tour personally. So yeah, definitely an interesting experience. And they, depending on which tour you take, they can take you in the visitor clubhouse, or I think there's one tour where it's called the Living Legends Tour, where for $5,000 you can take up to 100 people with you, or up to 50 people or something, and they bring a Cub legend along on the tour, and he gets to tell stories along with the tour guide.
Wow.
So yeah, when I saw
Wait,
the price,
how much is that?
I know, that's what I said. When I saw the price tag at first, I was like, $5,000. What kind of tour is this? And I read the thing. I was like, that's not that bad. Do I know 99 people who might be interested in throwing down $50?
Yeah, who each can pony up. Yeah.
So,
The thing about taking the tours, even if you watch it online, is there's nothing like being in the space.
right. And the stories are great. And that's why I have this podcast. But
Right.
to go walk through the concourse and walk through the press box and walk, you got to go there. The whole point is to
Right.
be there and to experience that.
You're in a cathedral of baseball.
Yep. Cool.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Mom. Okay, so that's it. In the introduction of this episode, I mentioned a trivia question you can answer to win something. And here's how you can do that. First, make sure you're following us on Twitter at Shoeless Podcast. Then, find the pinned tweet at the top of our profile with the link to the Brian Bernardoni episode, which asked this week's trivia question. The answer to the trivia question was somewhere in the episode you just finished listening to. Retweet that tweet along with your answer, and we'll announce the winner in next week's episode. You don't have to be first, you just have to be right. And you have to be following us. We'll pick one person who answered correctly, and they'll get a painted baseball from my friend Emily at Unforgettables, which commemorates opening day at Wrigley Field in 1926. The Cubs beat the Cincinnati Reds that day 4-2 with the help of Hack Wilson, Charlie Grimm, and Gabby Hartnett, who went a combined 4 for 9 with 2 doubles and an RBI and had 16 of the team's 27 putouts. The Reds team that day featured 1919 World Series hero and future Hall of Famer Ed Roush, and a first baseman named Wally Pipp, who later became a Yankee and is most well known today for a game he didn't play. On June 2nd, 1925, Pipp was batting .244 with only 3 home runs and 23 RBIs, and had a .181 batting average over the previous 3 weeks for the Yankees. Manager Miller Huggins, trying to light a fire under his 15-26 team that found themselves in 7th place, started 21-year-old Lou Gehrig in Pipp's place at first base. Lou had 3 hits that day and wouldn't be removed from the lineup for 2,130 straight games. The most popular version of the story, which first appeared in a 1939 New York World Telegram article on Gehrig's career in which Pipp was interviewed, said Pipp showed up at Yankee Stadium that day with a severe headache and asked the team's trainer for 2 aspirin. Miller Huggins noticed this and said, "Wally, take the day off. We'll try that kid Gehrig at first today and get you back in there tomorrow." Pipp was later quoted to have said, "I took the 2 most expensive aspirin in history." If you have questions about the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum, about the podcast, or about anything else, you can reach out on social media or email me at shoelesspodcast@gmail.com, and I'll try to answer them in next week's episode. If you want to send in a video or audio recording of your questions so I can play it on the show, that's cool too. A lot of you have rated and reviewed my baseball history in the past couple weeks, and we're so thankful for that. Spaceman Bill Lee left a 5-star rating and said, "Dan gives a fantastic, well-researched interview. He has a casual style that brings out the best in an interviewee. When I first saw that episodes are 2 hours long, I thought, I don't have time for a podcast this long. But 5 minutes in, I was changing my mind and making time to hear the whole show. Well worth the time investment." Thank you so much for those kind words. It's a huge help when you guys rate and review the show on whatever platform you choose to listen on. 5-star ratings help our podcast get shown on more people's suggested podcast pages, which means that more people will hear our show. It just takes a couple seconds of your time, but it really helps us a lot. And of course, liking us on social media, interacting with our posts, and sharing things with your friends is great too. No matter how you choose to support us, even if it's just by listening, we appreciate you being here. Until next time, I'm Dan Wallach, and this is My Baseball History.